Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for introducing us, and thank you everybody for being here today. I'm presenting a paper that I recently wrote, which kind of traces back social transformation since the Dutch hegemony, so about 500 years ago. And throughout this whole period, I tried to trace down the different social shifts and social movements that have actually changed the hegemonic system. As many of you guys know, there has been three major hegemonies. I will focus on those: the Dutch, the British, and the American hegemony. What is important to know, and what I want to get at, is that we're currently under a period of hegemonic crisis, in which it's not exactly sure whether we will have a completely different historical system to capitalism, or we will experience a different cycle of accumulation, which other new actors and other new players will actually take a role in the hegemonic bloc. I will focus mostly on the second scenario, that in which a new hegemonic cycle will take place, and I'll argue that many of the different social movements that first arose in the 60s and then in the 90s, mostly anti-racist, feminist, and ecologist movements, but also radical democracy movements, will play a role. But this role would probably, if it were to go into a different hegemonic transition, they would be tamed by capital, and they would be co-opted by it in a different way. Before I dive into the first hegemony, I think it's important to speak of Beverly Silver and Giovanni Arrigi's conception of hegemonic transitions and hegemonic periods. As I was mentioning before, there have been three major ones: the Dutch, the British, and the American. Arrigi mentions also the Genoese Iberian one, but I won't focus too much on that one. There's another topic that these authors, well, most world systems theories focus on, which is on the concept of major conflicts, major interstate conflict. I won't focus too much on that because I don't have much time, but it's not that I disregard completely this. It's just that I'm focusing more on the social movement and the social change of these transitions. Arrigi and Silver also have a conception of virtuous and vicious cycles within the systemic cycles of accumulation. The virtuous cycles generally are accompanied by material expansions of the hegemonic bloc. It's a period generally where manufacturers expand. Also, territorial expansion takes a huge role. And in these processes, even though there can be social upheavals, there can be social rebellion, those don't topple down the hegemonic bloc. They might alter it, but they don't really actually completely transform it. And also there's what they call the vicious cycles of accumulation. Oh no, sorry, they're just the vicious social cycles in which once financialization takes place and once finance expands, because material expansion of manufacturers cannot expand anymore. This process they deepen inequalities that are existent in the system, and these will get more profound throughout time. Eventually, in the vicious cycles, there's several social rebellions and social movements and all kinds of civil conflicts that eventually bring down the existing hegemony. In this point, I think I have some minor disagreements in their model. I do think that there's still social movements within the virtuous cycle, although I contend that they don't completely take the system down. They rebalance it between the different major powers that are applied, but doesn't really take the system down. The vicious cycle, I do agree with them that the social movements eventually bring the hegemonic bloc down. And again, like this, in the virtuous cycle, this financialization brings more competition amongst major core powers or different major states. And this also brings the hegemonic bloc down eventually. I'll focus a little bit on the Dutch hegemony. The Dutch hegemony came out of the 30 Years' War, which was a major conflict, a major religious conflict in mostly continental Europe, but it obviously had some repercussions in the rest of the world because the major powers at the time already were establishing colonies throughout the planet. The international system was actually regulated through the institutions that were established through the Westphalian system. And in this context, the merchant class dependent on the absolutist states raised as the major social hegemonic bloc. Those were basically the people who called the shots in this hegemony. Under the virtuous cycle of the Dutch hegemony, some of the material benefits of the expansion of commerce, of exploitation, and of colonization were shared by some upper strata workers and middle class from the Netherlands and other parts of continental Europe. Some of these people were artisans and people adjacent to the guilds that were already established in most of continental Europe. In this period, some revolutions and some rebellions actually took place, mostly slave rebellions in today's Latin America and in other parts of the world that were already being colonized by other major European powers, such as Southeast Asia, which was being conquered by the Dutch and the French, essentially. This period also had a period of financialization, which started really after the Spanish Succession War by the early 18th century. This, of course, brought much social malaise, much inequality. The people who had actually benefited from the first expansion, artisans, guilds, etc., started to see their income depleted, and in this period, the bourgeoisie and some of the national elites of the colonies started to rise as major contenders for power. These two forces, essentially, were eventually the ones who would topple down this hegemony and establish a new one, which is basically the British hegemony. In this regard, the independence revolutions in the Americas, first in North America, first here in what later would be the United States, but also in other parts of the Americas, such as the Haitian Revolution and the different revolutions of the newly created Latin American countries, kind of started to form a different international system. And under this new system, the bourgeoisie and the imperialist states from Europe became the major social bloc. The Concert of Europe and other different organizations, such as the Holy Alliance, established to a certain degree the international relations of this system, and then the international system as a system of governance. Obviously with Britain and London at the center. During the first period of the British hegemony, of the virtuous cycle of the British hegemony, even though manufacture and industry basically exploded thanks to the import and to the acquisition of very cheap raw materials from the colonies of the British and the French mostly, some people in the core, especially in the industrial centers of Britain, but also in continental Europe, some of their workers actually benefited from that, but not just a very tiny upper strata. However, it's important to note that during this virtuous cycle, there were also revolutions both in continental Europe and in parts of the periphery. The most important ones were obviously the world revolutions of 1830 and 1848, which eventually brought the cultural concept of the nation state. And some people have actually called this period the spring of the nations. But also other social rebellions were happening at the time in India, most famously because of the rebellion of 1857, but also in other parts of the colonies of the European powers. And obviously, this rebellions again didn't topple down the British hegemony, but they altered their relationship. And at this point, Germany and the United States started to increase their competition in the system. There's obviously the period of the vicious cycle, which is accompanied as well by a period of financialization because the market could not expand anymore by the expansion of manufacturers and industry. It had to do it through financialization. At this point, London became the center of global finance. And in this period, it's when labor uprisings start to become spread throughout the core. It's the time when the first socialist parties in Europe are actually created and founded. But it's also the period of most nationalistic movements in the periphery, especially in the colonies in Africa, but also in Southeast Asia and East Asia. This brings me to the American hegemony, which in which even if labor wasn't the major part of the hegemonic bloc, it was still a major part of it, as well as the new national leagues from the newly created countries, the new nation states, rather. In this regard, most of these movements, through a mix of compulsion and force, basically repressing the most radical labor movements and the most radical nationalist movements in the South, they were co-opted and tamed into the structure of global capitalism. And during the virtuous cycle, in parts of the core, and thanks to the concept of development in the core, but also in the Eastern Bloc and in the Third World, especially in the core, some of the workers actually experience material expansion or a material betterment in most people's lives. But it's important to note that in this period, there were also major rebellions within the world system. The most important ones probably would be in Cuba, the Chinese Revolution in the late 40s, early 50s, and other events in Iran too. But obviously, as with the other previous hegemonies, the material expansion only could get to a certain degree, and by the 70s, there was a major crisis in which we are really still living, which to a certain degree made the existing forces of capitalism introduce more what we call now neoliberalism, basically the financialization of everything, pretty much. And in this period, also there has been major rebellions which have a completely different character. At first, in the late 1960s, the anti-war movements, the feminist movements, the anti-racist movements started to take force. But then there's another kind of a second stage of these movements, which is in the 90s, especially in regards to radical democracy movements. Some people have different notions on when this starts. Some people say with the Zapatistas rebellion in 1994. Some other people it's with the Seattle protests. Some other people it's 2008 and 2011 protests, mostly in Northern Africa and Southern Europe. In whatever case, it seems like there's a major social movement, global in scope, against the capitalist system. And obviously, there's many elements of this that are more radical, and others that are more, I would like to, more tame inside the system. In this regard, I kind of want to end with kind of introspection of how this movement could turn out. One is one quote from Beverly Silver and Eric Slater in chaos and governance in the modern world system. It says, a new world hegemony after US hegemony, if there is to be one, will have to come to terms with the growing size and centrality of women and people of color among the workers of the world. And then another phrase by Arrighi in the long 20th century states, just as the liberal ideology of British hegemony had elevated the pursuit of wealth by property subjects above the absolute rights of government of rulers, so the ideology of the US hegemony has elevated welfare of all the subjects, as in high mass consumption, not as in rights or anything like that, above the absolute rights of property and the absolute rights of government. Now, it's in this regard, I think there's clearly in many, especially in the Fourth, there's a growing sense of elite conflict between people that basically want to maintain the system as it has been now, and other people who want to tame some of these movements and include them into their hegemonic bloc and change it. Just as labor in the early 20th century was eventually included as one of the major blocs through the extraction of more surplus value from the periphery, through the newly created nation states that had formal independence, but not actual real independence, there is a possibility that something like this would happen with ecologist movements, in the sense that some of the elites, again, some of the capitalist elites are seeing that there's basically an existential threat, but they probably want to change everything so that everything remains the same in a very Katopardian sense, as in the novel, the Leopard. I think, this is, especially this is illustrated in how different, for example, movements for the growth or other more ecologist movements are compared to, for example, the Green Party in Germany. Something like that would probably be the upcoming hegemonic bloc, and it would take the same shape as the previous hegemonic transitions. And with this reflection, I want to end, and thank you guys for listening.